Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. It was the pigs in George Orwell's Animal Farm who declared that all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And taking a leaf out of that book, ShashiTharoor now asks, are some Indians more Indian than others? And here is his answer. It's his latest book. It's called The Battle of Belonging. And with me to talk about this book, and of course that tantalizing question, is ShashiTharoor himself. Shashi, let's start with that tantalizing question. Are some Indians more Indian than others? How did it occur to you, and why do you think it's an important question to ask?
Well, it's become more important, Karan, because of the fact that the people who actually have a view on this, separate from that which was established during our nationalist movement, they are now in power for the last 6 years and seem increasingly determined to pursue a different answer to the question. So the basic issue here is that when the nationalist movement came to power, fighting for a united India, failed in the sense that it lost Pakistan, these issues were thrashed out in the Constituent Assembly. There were passionate debates about exactly what the Constitution of India was going to enshrine as the concept of Indian nationhood. And there were a handful who actually argued, as the BJP's intellectual forebears did in those days, that India is really a Hindu nation. Now that Pakistan's gone, we should create a Hindu nation. And a very conscious, deliberate view of the majority was no, our freedom movement was for everybody and our country would be for everybody. That fundamental issue seemed to be settled when I was growing up in this country. Clearly, it's been reopened in the last few years with the advantage of a governmental majority behind it.
So when you ask the question, are some Indians more Indian than others, are you suggesting that those who support the BJP and support its Hindutva ideology consider themselves more Indian than their opponents?
Well, they're essentially arguing that India is a Hindu nation. They're a party of Hindutva. They believe that Hindus are indeed the original, principal, primordial and perennial inhabitants of this nation, that everybody else is either a guest or an interloper. And therefore, their Indianness is unquestioned, others has to be proven. To my mind, that's fundamentally against the spirit of the concept.
So in simple language, you're saying that the BJP believes that Hindus are real Indians, others from other faiths are not as Indian as Hindus.
That's right. That's precisely the assumption underlying their philosophy since it was first articulated by Savarkar in 1922-23 all the way till today, almost a century. You've got an evolution of this thinking and a reiteration of this thinking through every single major voice of the Hindutva movement. You've seen it in Savarkar himself, Golwalkar, the longest serving Sarsang Chalak of the RSS, Deen Dayal Upadhyay, whom Prime Minister Modi has hailed repeatedly as his guru. All of them have kept insisting upon this. In fact, the classic critique of the Constitution by them was this, that the Constitution seems to assume that India is a territory and is written for all the people on it. Wrong, they said, all three of them, Savarkar, Golwalkar, Upadhyay, they said, wrong. A nation is not a territory, it's a people, and the people of the Indian nation are the Hindu people. That's their answer, and that's the premise on which their entire political movement is founded.
So would I be right in saying that this book, and I'm holding it up so the audience can say it, this book is your intellectual refutation of the BJP's claim or belief that their idea of India, their vision of India is the right one, the best one?
It ends up being there, Karan. It starts off really with a global survey of the theory, concept, evolution of nationalism worldwide. Then it talks about the nationalism of the freedom struggle and the Constitution, which enshrined a vision of Indian nationhood that we talk about in the book. And then it comes up to saying, however, this is contested. Here's the BJP view, and I give it, I hope, very fairly. And then I talk about the politics of the last few years, as well as end with a pain to refute, as well as to
But why do you
fight
call
for it.
the book The Battle of Belonging?
Because it's about who belongs to India. You see, I have talked about the distinction, for example, between patriotism and nationalism, where patriotism is about love. It's about loving your country. You feel you belong to it. You feel it belongs to you. It's like loving your mother. Whereas nationalism is more of an intellectual construct. It involves a state, involves a flag, involves symbols and slogans. And the point is that those who are representing the present ruling party and the ruling establishment of this country prefer to treat the Indian nation as an emanation of Hindutva and the Hindu people.
It's fascinating that you've actually collapsed your answer into the very subject that I wanted to raise, because I was going to point out that one of the threads that runs like a leitmotif through your book is a debate between nationalism and patriotism. And quite clearly, as you said in this answer yourself, but quite clearly in the book, you come down strongly on the side of patriotism. You believe it's the preferable of the two sentiments. But let me ask you, why?
Well, first of all, because patriotism is essentially benign. As I said, it's about love. And when you love someone, it is not about putting down anyone else. It's merely about your feelings of attachment, of belonging. It belongs to you, you belong to it. You belong to her, she belongs to you, all that sort of thing. Now that
nationalism is about belonging to.
But nationalism is about belonging to, except because it is not, as it were, emerging from the body but from the mind. Nationalism imagines a whole panoply of structures, as I mentioned, the state, the government, the flag, the slogan, the anthem, the whole works, and is often articulated in opposition to other nationalisms and asserts the superiority of itself.
Let me quarrel with the way you began that answer. Patriotism, you said, is essentially benign. Have you forgotten what Samuel Johnson said 245 years ago, long before nationalism was even dreamt of? He said patriotism was the last refuge of the scoundrel.
It remains true, Karan. I think Dr. Johnson was absolutely right, because even today, you will find political leaders wrapping themselves in the national flag. But that's indeed...
But you're making my point. Patriotism can be therefore misused and abused in exactly similar sort of ways, as badly or as evilly as nationalism. Why then prefer one to the other?
Only in the service of nationalism. You know, it's interesting. When you, and I've gone through this in some detail in the book, as you point out, when you look at it carefully, one of the distinctions I make, I have a sentence in the book that says, yes, they're both prepared to die for their country, right? The patriot is prepared to give up his life for his country, but the nationalist is prepared to kill for his state. Now, there is a difference.
No, forgive me, that's a distinction that you're creating by creating a distinction between country and state. Let's be honest. For most people, patriotism is a feeling of love for your country, so is nationalism. You're adding attributes to nationalism, deliberately designed to make it a despicable sort of concept or a lesser concept. You're adding qualities to patriotism which ignores the fact that it can be misused and is often misused by people. People who wrap themselves in the flag are simply doing it to prove they're better, not because of any great love of the country they have.
Well, no, they want to demonstrate to their own voters or their own people or their own supporters that their love for the country is what makes them worthy of support. That's why the scoundrel of Johnson's phrase chooses to appeal to people on that basis. But no, I tell you, the distinction is not me alone, and that's why I've quoted a number of authorities. For once in this book, I do rely a lot on pre-existing scholarship and writing on both these subjects. Don't forget, in our own country, 100 years ago, Tagore wrote a wonderful essay on nationalism. Orwell, 70 years ago, wrote an excellent essay on nationalism. There are fine thinkers, as well as academics and scholars, who've delved into this. I'll tell you another thing about patriotism and nationalism.
There's no doubt that in your book you rely on thinkers who've had a fairly derisory view of nationalism. That's and right. You quote them in support of the fact that you don't like nationalism. However, you also say things about nationalism that simply aren't true. And I'm going to quote one to you. To the nationalist, his government is beyond questioning. It's always right. Patriots harbor no such illusions. What gives you the impression that a nationalist won't criticize his government?
Because that's unfortunately the way in which nationalism has been interpreted and sold around the world, and particularly in our country. Today,
take our country as an example. The archetypical nationalist in India is a member of the Indian Armed Forces. We hold them as the prime example of nationalists. And yet army officers retired or serving are frequently critical, not just of the government, of the country. Just look at it. They bemoan the lack of national character.
So again, Karan, you're eliding a slightly more complex argument in my book. I talk about the various types of nationalism, and then I say essentially we can divide them all into the nationalism that emerges from the sense of identity, ethnicity, race, religion, language, your place of birth, your identity, immutable qualities, and what I call civic nationalism, which is the nationalism of liberal democracies and a nationalism that embraces the liberal constitutionalism we see in India. So that kind of nationalism...
I'm not sure whether civic nationalism actually qualifies for the word nationalism. Civic nationalism is simply a composite term for the qualities that a liberal constitution, a democratic constitution confers upon the people of that state or that country. You call it civic nationalism because you want to oppose it to what you consider ethnic or tribal or religious nationalism, but that's a construct of your own. I'm coming back to the fact that nationalists, whether they're of the ethnic and religious variety or the civic variety, can and do criticize their governments. Indian army officers are a classic example.
No, but if your nationalism is of the civic nationalist variety, that absolutely requires dissent and disagreement and debate. In fact, I've argued, as you know, that it's actually the prime duty of the true patriot within civic nationalism to criticize his government. You see, let me explain.
Army officers in India who support the BJP criticize the country on the grounds that it lacks character.
No, it
doesn't. We lack national character.
So my point is, a patriot or a civic nationalist, and the two are, as I say, conflatable, essentially defends as well as constructively criticizes the country. The conventional nationalist supports the government. So when I said, for example, on social media, that true patriotism is about defending your country always, but defending your government only when it deserves it, I got a huge pushback from supporters of the ruling party, who all said that is simply not true, etc., that our government is beyond.
No, I think once again you're deciding to identify nationalists and nationalism with this definition: defending your country always, but defending the government only when you need to.
When it deserves it.
That is also true of patriots. The point I'm making is that the distinction you're drawing between the two, patriotism and nationalism, actually is not quite as clear-cut as you make it seem, which is why the fact that you don't like one and you like the other doesn't really follow. And let me give you an example. You say elsewhere in your book, and I'm going to quote this to you, nationalists demonize those outside his nationalist framework. Anyone who disagrees has to be put down. Just go back in time to the great era of nationalism, the early 20th century, after the Habsburg Empire fell apart, nation states came up in Europe. They didn't demonize each other. All they wanted was to be recognized as individual national states in themselves.
But in the process, they demonized those who were denying them that recognition, and they, in many cases, killed them too. So there is indeed this demonization. See, I have talked about the
that would apply to the Indian independence movement as well. There were many in India who killed the British. There was, in fact, a well-respected tradition in the 20s of terror. We don't call it terror, right?
There were a few who did that, but as Gandhiji said, hate the sin and not the sinner. So he said, we will not demonize the British, but what they're doing is a sin. He wrote to the Viceroy saying that. So Gandhiji still drew a distinction between the imperialists and imperialism.
When the Czechoslovak Republic came into being, when Hungary first came into being as an independent country, or the countries that comprised Yugoslavia later on, Serbia, Croatia, they didn't demonize each other. All they wanted was recognition of their own separate individual nation statehood. This belief that nationalists demonize each other is your introduction to demonize nationalism.
You know, Karan, first of all, I don't claim any great originality for that insight, because there's an awful lot of literature, including the writings of people like Tagore and Orwell, as well as the various academic experts on the subject that back me up. But equally, what you're saying is not historically accurate, because there was a lot of demonizing. You mentioned Yugoslavia. Don't forget, it began with the assassination of the Archduke of Austria of the Austro-Hungarian Empire by a Serbian nationalist. And having myself been present during the crumbling of that nationalist idea into 6 new nationalisms that fought each other bitterly, and what was brought together at the end of the First World War as the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, i.e. what became Yugoslavia, has now crumbled into 6 sovereign states. So you look, and in fact
70, 80, 90 years later, you can't read that back to what happened in 1918.
I'm just saying that therefore,
and the assassination,
and they killed each other in the process.
But the assassination of Franz Ferdinand can't really be represented as demonization. That's a stretch of the word. But leave that aside. It's not just that you seem to dislike nationalism to the point that you attribute qualities to it which may or may not exist. Let's look at the way you identify patriotism, because that's clearly the sentiment, the emotion that you applaud.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. Is it unpatriotic to give up your passport and take instead a British and American passport? And before you answer, I should point out to the audience, your son Ishan did this, and you mentioned that yourself in the book. Yeah. Is it unpatriotic to give up your passport and take up a British and American one instead?
It is. Now, it doesn't mean that the love for your original homeland has disappeared, but it does mean that you put certain practical conveniences ahead of that love. Now, it's not an easy choice for many to make in the modern world, which is why my son also argued, why doesn't India, like so many other democracies, allow dual citizenship so I don't have to give up my passport?
Except that that argument doesn't touch upon the central question I asked, because it doesn't allow it
Of
to
course.
any Indian citizen.
Because now his patriotism is transferred to a different place.
Let me put it like this. There are thousands of Indians, you and me are an example, who've lived abroad for years, decades,
And never given up our
remained
passport.
Indian citizens.
That's right.
And we had to bear the inconvenience of the fact that whenever we wanted to travel, we had to get a visa every time. You couldn't simply wake up on Saturday morning in London and say, I'm off to Paris for the weekend, because you couldn't if you didn't have a visa. Yet, despite that inconvenience, we continued to be Indian. Is someone like Ishan, or the many others who changed on grounds of convenience and became British, less patriotic than us?
They're less patriotic about India, yes, absolutely. And I think it's partly because, of course, in the case of Ishan, he didn't grow up in India, so his love is not anchored in the kind of daily experiences of India that you and I have had as young people, as children, and therefore our atavism that undergirds our patriotism is not there in his case, and so I don't particularly blame him. But there are many Indians who, in every respect, culturally, in terms of their associations, their blood relationships, their rooting, their education, everything, would prefer to be Indian patriots, but for reasons to do with their present work situation, their life situation, their future prospects, they prefer to now take another country's passport. And those gentlemen and ladies are deprived of an option that many democracies do give their people.
Absolutely, but that is a situation that applies to every Indian, so leave it aside. You're saying to me that holding on to your Indian passport, which is your Indian identity in that sense, even when it's inconvenient to do so, even when visas are more difficult to get, is actually proof of patriotism. And if you give it up and choose to become American or British instead because it's more convenient, then what it means is convenience has trumped love of country.
To a great extent, that's true. But remember, they're just holding on to a passport alone is not proof of either patriotism or loyalty to the nation, or traitors wouldn't exist. There have been instances of treason. We know in our own country people who've sold secrets to foreign powers despite holding Indian passports. So I don't think that just holding on to the passport is a certificate necessarily enough of patriotism, but it's
not holding on, but giving it up. Giving it up.
Exercising the choice not to give it up suggests that you are more patriotic than those who do.
So then you're really saying that you and I, because we held on to our Indian passport while living abroad, are more patriotic than Ishan, who chose to give it up?
I'm afraid so.
You really believe that?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me try another.
In fact, his patriotism will now have to be soon enough to the American.
Let me try another test case with you. Let me take up Bharat Mata Ki Jai. The BJP firmly believes that chanting Bharat Mata Ki Jai is proof of patriotism. They also say refusal to say it is unpatriotic.
So I disagree with that, because I don't believe that in the civic nationalism of our constitution that you actually are obliged to pass any litmus test imposed by any ruling party. The truth is, I have no difficulty saying it.
You aren't even required under the constitution to love your country.
That's true. But that's true of almost any country's constitutions. I mean, every country will define disloyalty and treachery.
So the fact that Bharat Mata Ki Jai is not a litmus test under the constitution is therefore an extraneous argument.
But there is a litmus test, which is the right to silence. You see, by saying you have to say something, and denying to whatever small percentage of Indians who don't want to say it the right to remain silent, you are actually being unconstitutional.
So refusal to say Bharat Mata Ki Jai on the grounds that you have a right to silence is not unpatriotic. But what about the opposite? Is chanting it proof of patriotism?
Not at all. I think it's proof of a particular political allegiance in our country.
So on both counts, the BJP is wrong.
I think they're wrong completely to do this. And in fact, it's very interesting. I've quoted a speech by Nehruji back in the 1940s, in which, when he was greeted with the chant of Bharat Mata Ki Jai by the crowd in northern India, he asked them what they understood by Bharat Mata. And in the end, the speech ends up with him basically telling them,
you Bharat Mata is you.
The people of India are Bharat Mata.
In which case, let me ask you this. Is this slogan, Bharat Mata Ki Jai, which has become both so well known and so politically controversial, is it a patriotic slogan? Is it a nationalist slogan? Or does it depend on the circumstances and context in which it's said?
Exactly. And depends on also who's asking you to say it and why. I mean, I can give you an example of almost embarrassing patriotism. I was in a European airport once and found myself in a bus going from one terminal to another, surrounded by a whole bunch of Indian passengers who literally, they'd all come back from some pilgrimage of some sort somewhere somewhere abroad, and they all came to me. They started saying in Hindi. They were all from northern India. Kuch boliye to hame. So I said, "Theek hai, Bharat Mata ki jai," and the whole bus, airport bus, to the astonishment of the German driver or whatever, was just full of chants of Bharat Mata ki jai. And this was well before the BJP created a controversy out of it. So,
which is
to my mind, that was merely a way of saying something that identified all the Indians in the bus in a sort of shared expression of patriotism. But when you come here and the president of the ruling party says to an audience, I've been present when he did that, he's challenging them to say or not say it, I refuse to say it.
This is why I asked the question, is it a patriotic slogan, is it a nationalist slogan, or does that entirely depend on the context?
I think it depends on the context, the circumstances, the motives.
On that bus at the airport in Germany, it was clearly an expression of love of India and therefore
and of
patriotism.
connection to the others. It's something that ties you into people. Let me go back briefly to Ishan. I don't want to leave that answer fully hanging, which is that Ishan, when he's now sort of given up patriotism to India, as it were, he has said simultaneously on the day he took the American citizenship that he was not signing up for a sort of blood and soil version of American nationalism, but for civic nationalism.
Well, let me in fact contradict you there and put this to you. I don't think Ishan has actually stopped being an Indian patriot just because he's changed his passport. I asked you that clearly, slightly with a trick in mind, because I know that you've actually suggested in your book it's less patriotic if you give up your citizenship. Yeah. But I don't think it is. I think love of a country, which is what patriotism is, not necessarily conditioned by whether you hold on to totems like your passport or a register or whatever. But let's come back to your book, because in your book you choose to define on page 398 what you call true patriotism. And I'm going to read out to you your definition of true patriotism. When a Malayali can get a lump in his throat hearing a Bengali sing a DL Ray song, pine for the coffee house on his Delhi University campus, celebrate the festivals of his Bombay classmates, and be moved to an inexpressible longing by the aroma of freshly steamed idlis in a Kerala village. Why is that truer patriotism than the desperate longing a migrant worker has for his little unknown village in Uttarakhand?
No, it's exactly the same.
Well, it's not. You call this true patriotism.
No. I was giving that as an example, Karan. You have to read the entire context.
I am. I've read the whole page.
It's an example relating to myself, because those are things that I associate.
But what I'm what I'm pointing out is what you call true patriotism may be cosmopolitan, but it's not necessarily truer patriotism than a migrant worker in Delhi yearning for his little village in Uttarakhand.
No, totally correct.
He's not cosmopolitan. But Karan, this guy is, but it's still patriotism.
In fact, I say that patriotism for India is made up of a whole lot of little local patriotisms. And this local patriotism is precisely the sum total of local patriotisms is what gives us our national patriotism. It so happens I may have personally had a more cosmopolitan background, but the migrant worker yearning for Uttarakhand, or for that matter, the Kerala villager who only knows his or her own village, for me, that's part of their sense of love for their country, for who they are, for what belongs to them.
I'm delighted to hear you correct yourself, because actually if you go back to page 398 of your book, you clearly give the impression, not just the impression, you clearly state, not the impression, you clearly state that true patriotism is these things combined. And what I said to myself when I read it, I said, hang on a second, this is cosmopolitan, no doubt, but why is it truer patriotism than a migrant worker who identifies only
it's not true at all.
Patch of Uttarakhand?
I do not say it's true. And what is more, at the end of our interview, I will go into the book
and find the phrase, true patriotism. And if you want, I've got the book with me and I'll find it for you.
No, I'll find you.
Hang on a second, I'll find it. It's page 398. I've got it here. I wrote it down on purpose because I half suspected you would dispute what I'm saying. And therefore I said it's very important to have...
I said this, but I didn't read it.
Here's the sentence.
I didn't say this is the only...
Hang on a second. That is true patriotism. When a Malayali can get a lump in his throat...
Go back a little earlier, please, and see where this is coming from. Can I have a look at the book? I'll just show you.
Hang on a second. Earlier is a quotation from Khwaja Ahmad Abbas. And then you say, and I'm quoting, that is true patriotism. When a Malayali can get a lump in his throat singing a Bengali DL Ray song, and then you quote that song in Bengali, which I can't say, and then you add, and pine for the coffee house on his Delhi University campus, celebrate the festivals of his Bombay classmates, and be moved to an inexpressible longing by the aroma of freshly steamed idlis in a Kerala village. And you add,
That's me.
yes, that
but
is,
you can have your own
but
examples.
you
The
called it,
Uttarakhand migrant can have
but
his own.
Shashi, you called your cosmopolitan example.
Can I please see it for a second?
Afterwards, I'll show it to you. I've quoted the passage. You call your cosmopolitan example true patriotism, and
No.
I'm saying to you, why
I
is it
explicitly say in the book that patriotism must be anchored in a local love for your own, for that which you feel you belong to. I happen to have a pan-national sense of belonging. Somebody else may have a totally local belonging, but that patriotism, or patriotism as I've been saying it all along, that is to my mind true patriotism. Mine is merely an example.
I'm glad to hear you make what I call that correction. The impression your book creates is different, but let others read it. I hope this will encourage them to pick up the book and see, if nothing else, am I right or you? But let me end by moving to something that I think is equally important, particularly in the context of the discussion we're having of nationalism versus patriotism. I want to talk about an issue the Prime Minister raised very recently when he inaugurated the statue of Swami Vivekananda Jawaharlal Nehru University. He said, national interest is more important than ideology, and we must not give more importance to ideology over national interest. Now, to me, that clearly suggests that there are some ideologies the Prime Minister thinks are anti-national. How do you respond to this belief that national interest is more important than ideology?
National interest is defined by the nationals of the country, and it's a sum total of entire process of deliberative discussion in a democracy within the institutions and constitution of your country that will then lead to a consensual definition of what your national interest is. Now, the point is that until you have various ideologies contending in a democracy, how do you know what that national interest is?
Absolutely. In fact, you've said almost what I was going to ask. I would say that, in fact, what your national ideology is will determine what you believe is in the national interest. The Prime Minister is saying exactly the opposite. He says national interest should determine what ideology you espouse. Somehow, we are all to be creatures of a predefined national interest, and anything that is not in accordance with that definition cannot be an ideology you espouse.
So that, to me, is part of this entire problem. Of course, I wrote the book before he said those words, but it's part of this entire problem of the government choosing to conflate the ruling party with the government with the nation with the state, and everyone who criticizes any of these is therefore anti-national. That is fundamentally undemocratic and is against the spirit of civic nationalism that is the nationalism I celebrate.
In fact, the government has gone one step further. They've conflated the national interest and any understanding of what being Indian is with the Prime Minister and his thinking on the subject. What he says is the final word for everyone as far as the government is concerned.
The Prime Minister is the ruling party is the government is the nation, is the state, and the state is the nation. That's the essential, shall we say, syllogism that the ruling party has chosen to inflict upon us. We shouldn't accept it.
My last question. In your prologue you say, and in a sense you hinted at this when we were beginning the interview, that the BJP contests the idea of India that emerged out of the independence struggle and that got crystallized over the next 70 years. Why is the idea of India immutable? Why can it not change with time? After all, the idea of America enshrined in the 1789 Constitution is very different to the country that exists today.
No, the core principles of it are unchanged, but for example, it didn't accommodate slaves, it didn't accommodate women. I mean, I didn't say slaves. It accommodated slaves, not as free citizens. It didn't accommodate women, didn't give them rights. So clearly, that has evolved. And India too can evolve, but it's got to evolve within the framework established in our civic nationalism. That's my argument. In other words, there is nothing to my mind inherently illegitimate about people having different views about what India is all about. That's part of the process of contention. You argue it, you debate it. But to my mind, the entire foundational basis of the Republic of India, as established between 47 and 50, with the aftermath of partition and the writing of the Constitution, is of a country where everybody is equal, everyone's got equal rights to think of themselves as Indian and to claim India's allegiance to them and theirs to India. That fundamental idea, to my mind, is not negotiable.
I'm not a defender of the BJP. I make it crystal clear I don't agree with their views. But nonetheless, let me, as the interviewer, play devil's advocate. Because the BJP would say, when we contest the idea of India that ShashiTharoor applauds and upholds, we're not undermining it. We're redefining it in the way in which the term secularism is understood in Britain. Because it's over secularism that this whole difference emerges. After all, Britain is a Christian country. The Queen is the defender of the faith. It is officially a country that is a Christian country constitutionally. Yet it's a more secular country in its functioning than India. And all the BJP would say is that we want recognition of the fact that whilst a secular country, the majority population in India is Hindu. Recognize that fact. It won't change anything, but it is a recognition of a reality that we want people to open their eyes to, not to deliberately shut off. And we can still be a secular country.
The problem with that interpretation is its practical application to the lives of ordinary Indians today. The moment you start privileging one category of people, you are essentially denying others the rights to fully partake of the experience of Indianness today. That's the first and biggest problem.
You mean calling India a Hindu country but insisting that it will be secular and its functioning would privilege one category of people? That's what the BJP would ask. After all, Britain is a Christian country. Germany is a Christian country. France is a Catholic country. But they're all secular. France, in addition, has this laïcité, which is a very strict form of secularism. The two don't contradict there, secularism and the identification of the country with the religion. Why would they contradict in
but
India?
their constitution doesn't call them a Christian country. I mean, the ethos of France is very strongly Christian, but it doesn't make it a Christian country. In the case of India...
Come back to Britain, defender of the faith, that's the Queen.
So the British, of course, don't have a written constitution, but you're right, the monarch has carried the title defender of the faith and the fidei defensor, and at the same time, they have, as you said, run essentially a secular state where it's perfectly permissible to blaspheme any faith, including the official faith of the land. The Anglican Church is an established church, but other churches flourish.
The BJP, presumably, and I'm carrying on playing devil's advocate, I'm not defending them, would say that we want a similar attitude to secularism in India. We will be secular, but acknowledge the fact we're a Hindu majority country. 80% are Hindu.
Unfortunately, their conduct in interpreting and applying this belief is very different from, say, the Christian Democrats in Germany or the Conservatives.
I mean, there's a big divide between what they claim to believe in and what they actually practice. And it's that divide that demolishes their argument.
I would argue that up to a point, the Vajpayee BJP was more like the Christian Democrats of Germany than like the BJP of today. In other words, that it was very strongly avowedly...
So would the Vajpayee BJP or the Advani BJP be acceptable to you? That definition of India? We're secular in our practice, but we want to also accept that we're a Hindu majority country because you can't deny it.
No, it's not acceptable to me because I have a different set of beliefs, which I've articulated in this book. But it's certainly a legitimate point of view that they can advocate and they can test against the power of the ballot box. What we've got today is something that is not even up for grabs of the ballot box. It is basically saying this is what the country is all about. And the rest of you should lump it.
In other words, what you got today is an imposition and an assertion.
I've talked about the CAA and the NRC as a classic example of how this actually affects the well-being of minorities in this country, in this case particularly the Muslim minority.
And this is why I presume you would say that whereas the Vajpayee or Advani BJP was not necessarily contesting the idea of India, the present government is definitely not just contesting it, but seeking to demolish and undermine it.
Exactly right.
And this is the difference between Vajpayee and Modi.
I think that's one of the many differences between Mr. Vajpayee and Mr. Modi. We see it across the board in everything from the way in which Mr. Vajpayee dealt with Kashmir to the way in which Vajpayee dealt with other parties in the political space, to Vajpayee's own eulogy of Nehru when Nehru passed away, by comparison with the disparaging remarks of our present Prime Minister.
ShashiTharoor, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. And I have to end by asking you this. When you thought of that question, are some Indians more Indian than others? I take it you were aware of the fact that you were echoing Napoleon and Snowball from Animal Farm.
Animal Farm, some animals are more equal than others. Yes, that was
and
very
Napoleon
much
and Snowball were pigs.
They were indeed, and they were the they were superior to everyone else in the establishment. As you know, that was actually an analogy about communism. Ours is a different situation altogether. But the fact is, as I mentioned, the book is also intensely personal because it raises these questions in the context of my own interrogation of who I am. I was born in London. I was entitled to another passport. I chose not to take it. I have defined myself as who I am and asked myself, what does that mean? What does it consist of? What does it stand for? And the book is a long answer to that.
And let me tongue-in-cheek end by pointing out that wonderful description of yourself either suggests you're cosmopolitan or you're a khichdi.
No, I speak more in terms of a thali, as you know. The thali concept of nationalism for me is that
a
all
bit
of us,
of this, a bit of that, and
but
I have it all together.
in separate bowls, all on the same platter. Whereas the khichdi stirs them all together. There might be the occasional piece of aloo or gajar, but essentially we're all one Hindu.
You like your bits and pieces kept separate.
I do indeed.
ShashiTharoor, a pleasure talking to you. Take care, stay safe.
Thank you, Karan.